Conflicts between nations arise from deep-rooted issues, such as territorial disputes, ideological clashes, and historical grievances. Understanding these tensions offers a clearer view of global challenges and the potential paths to peace. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine began in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea, followed by separatist uprisings in eastern Ukraine. Tensions escalated significantly in 2022 when Russia launched a full-scale invasion, citing security concerns and historical ties to Ukrainian territories. Ukraine, with international support, has fiercely resisted, resulting in widespread devastation, mass displacement, and ongoing military confrontations. The geopolitical stakes involve NATO expansion, European security, and energy dependencies. With relations at a breaking point, the outlook remains grim. Since 1948, the Israel-Palestine conflict has centered on competing claims to land, sovereignty, and historical rights. The key flashpoints are Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Violence erupts periodically, including airstrikes, rocket attacks, and ground conflicts, exacerbating humanitarian crises. Diplomatic attempts, such as the Oslo Accords, have failed to achieve lasting peace. Both sides maintain rigid stances, making resolution extremely challenging. This conflict remains one of the world's most entrenched disputes. The USA and Iran's animosity dates back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the subsequent hostage crisis. Key issues include Iran's nuclear ambitions, regional influence, and U.S.-imposed sanctions. Proxy conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen have further strained relations. The 2015 nuclear deal offered hope for de-escalation, but collapsed in 2018. Tensions remain high, with periodic military confrontations and no viable diplomatic breakthrough. Partitioned in 1947, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars, primarily over the contested Kashmir region. Religious and cultural differences underpin this rivalry, along with cross-border terrorism and political disputes. Despite ceasefire agreements, skirmishes along the line of control are frequent. While international mediation has attempted to calm tensions, both nations remain firmly entrenched in their positions, with no peaceful resolution on the horizon. The China-Taiwan conflict stems from the Chinese Civil War, where the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan in 1949. China views Taiwan as a renegade province, while Taiwan operates with democratic governance and international recognition. Increased Chinese military activity near Taiwan and growing U.S.-Taiwan relations have exacerbated tensions. The situation is a focal point of East Asia security concerns, with both sides unwilling to compromise. Since the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the Korean Peninsula has been a global flashpoint. North Korea's authoritarian regime, nuclear ambitions, and provocations contrast sharply with South Korea's democratic governance and Western alliances. Occasional talks have faltered due to mistrust and policy differences. The demilitarized zone remains one of the world's most heavily fortified borders. The conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia revolves around the Nagorno-Karabakh region, a predominantly Armenian enclave within Azerbaijani territory. Clashes date back to the late 1980s, escalating into war after the Soviet Union's collapse. A ceasefire brokered in 2020 ended major hostilities, but the region remains volatile, with periodic skirmishes and mutual distrust. The dispute is deeply rooted in ethnic and historical grievances, and prospects for peace are slim without significant international mediation. The Saudi-Yemen conflict escalated in 2015 when Saudi Arabia led a coalition against Houthi rebels, who are backed by Iran. The war has caused severe humanitarian crises, including famine and displacement, with Yemen often described as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. Peace efforts have repeatedly stalled, and hostilities persist, deepening the region's instability. Tensions between Turkey and Syria have escalated since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. Turkey has conducted military operations in northern Syria, targeting Kurdish groups it views as terrorists and securing a buffer zone along the border. Syria, embroiled in its internal conflict, accuses Turkey of violating sovereignty. The situation is complicated by the presence of refugees, international interventions, and the ongoing civil war, leaving little hope for reconciliation. The Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict stems from a border dispute following Eritrea's independence in 1993. A full-scale war erupted between 1998 and 2000, leaving tens of thousands dead. Despite a peace agreement in 2018, tensions persist due to unresolved territorial claims and internal instability in Ethiopia, particularly in the Tigray region. The conflict remains a significant challenge for peace in the Horn of Africa. After South Sudan gained independence in 2011, disputes over oil-rich border regions and ethnic divisions have kept the two nations at odds. Armed conflicts and humanitarian crises, including displacement and famine, plague the region. Efforts to mediate peace have seen limited success, and relations remain tense, with sporadic violence undermining stability. Political and ideological differences underlie the strained relationship between Colombia and Venezuela, worsened by border disputes and allegations of harboring militants. Venezuela's economic collapse has triggered a massive refugee crisis, further complicating ties. Diplomatic efforts have been inconsistent, with ongoing hostility defining their relations. The India-China border conflict, rooted in disputed territories like Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh, dates back to the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Clashes along the line of actual control (LAC), including a deadly standoff in 2020, have exacerbated tensions. Despite high-level talks, mutual distrust and military buildups indicate a prolonged stalemate. Relations between the USA and North Korea have been fraught since the Korean War, characterized by North Korea's nuclear ambitions and antagonistic rhetoric toward the U.S. Despite historic summits in 2018 and 2019, no substantive agreements were reached. Tensions remain high, with the Korean Peninsula a focal point for global security concerns. Dominated by sectarian Sunni Shia and geopolitical rivalries, Saudi Arabia and Iran are involved in proxy wars across the Middle East, notably in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. This struggle for regional dominance influences global oil markets and diplomacy. Despite occasional overtures, relations remain deeply strained, with persistent risk of escalation. The Israel-Lebanon conflict stems from border disputes and the presence of Hezbollah, a militant group supported by Iran. Israel frequently conducts airstrikes in southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah positions, while Lebanon accuses Israel of territorial violations. This rivalry intensified during the 2006 war and remains a significant point of tension in the Middle East. The conflict is fueled by deep-seated mistrust and geopolitical rivalries, with little progress toward a peaceful resolution. The situation remains highly volatile, impacting regional stability. The Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict is rooted in territorial disputes, particularly over the Durand Line, which Pakistan recognizes as an international boundary while Afghanistan disputes its legitimacy. Cross-border terrorism and the presence of militant groups further strain relations. Both countries have accused each other of harboring insurgents that destabilize the region. The situation worsened after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, as Pakistan faces spillover effects from Afghanistan's internal instability. Despite occasional dialogue, mistrust and security concerns keep tensions high, with little progress toward lasting resolution. Since the 2008 war, Russia and Georgia remain in conflict over the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which Russia recognizes as independent states. Georgia views these regions as occupied. Diplomatic ties are minimal, and the situation remains a flashpoint for wider regional tensions in the Caucasus. The China-U.S. rivalry spans trade, technology, military dominance, and ideology. Issues include Taiwan, the South China Sea, and human rights. The conflict has intensified in recent years, with both sides engaged in economic decoupling and military posturing. This rivalry significantly shapes global geopolitics. Historical grievances, particularly over Japan's colonial occupation of Korea and wartime abuses, underlie tensions between South Korea and Japan. Trade disputes and territorial claims over the Dokdo/Takeshima Islands have exacerbated animosities, though economic and strategic ties occasionally bring cooperation. The Algeria-Morocco rivalry, centered on the Western Sahara conflict, involves disputes over sovereignty and regional influence. Algeria's severing of diplomatic ties in 2021 underscores the depth of animosity. Mediation efforts have faltered, and relations remain tense. Tensions between Ukraine and Belarus intensified after Belarus aligned with Russia during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Belarus's support for Russian military actions has strained ties, with Ukraine viewing Belarus as complicit in aggression. Diplomatic relations are at a low point, with no resolution in sight. Israel and Syria remain at odds over the Golan Heights, occupied by Israel since 1967. Syria's alliance with Iran and hosting of anti-Israel groups further fuels hostilities. Periodic Israeli airstrikes on Iranian targets in Syria maintain the cycle of tension, with no diplomatic progress in sight. The conflict between Iran and Israel is rooted in ideological, political, and security concerns. Iran's support for anti-Israel groups like Hezbollah and its nuclear program have heightened tensions, while Israel frequently conducts military strikes against Iranian interests in Syria. This rivalry represents a key source of instability in the Middle East, with little hope for de-escalation in the near future. Tensions between Russia and Poland stem from historical conflicts and contemporary political differences. Poland, a NATO member, views Russia as a primary security threat, particularly after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Military buildups along Eastern Europe's borders underscore the gravity of their strained relations. The Jeju/Senkaku Islands dispute symbolizes the broader tensions between Japan and China, fueled by historical grievances and competing territorial claims. Military maneuvers and nationalistic rhetoric perpetuate the rivalry, complicating prospects for reconciliation despite significant economic ties. The India-Nepal conflict is primarily focused on territorial disputes, particularly over the Kalapani-Olympiad-Dirlipilek region. Nepal claims these areas based on historical maps, while India asserts sovereignty through administrative control and historical treaties. Tensions escalated in 2020 when both countries issued conflicting maps. Despite strong cultural, economic, and historical ties, this dispute has strained bilateral relations. Nepal has also voiced concerns over perceived Indian interference in its domestic politics. Although both nations have expressed a willingness to resolve disputes through dialogue, progress remains slow, leaving the conflict unresolved. The conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan is deeply rooted in territorial disputes and cross-border militancy. The primary issue revolves around the Durand Line, a colonial-era boundary drawn in 1893, which Pakistan recognizes as the international border, while Afghanistan disputes its legitimacy. This disagreement has fueled tensions for decades. Additionally, both countries accuse each other of supporting insurgent groups that destabilize the region. Pakistan claims Afghanistan harbors anti-Pakistan militants, while Afghanistan accuses Pakistan of backing the Taliban. These accusations have exacerbated mistrust, particularly after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. Despite attempts at diplomatic dialogue, security concerns and political instability in Afghanistan have hindered progress toward a peaceful resolution. The situation remains tense, with periodic border skirmishes further straining relations. While many conflicts remain unresolved, the pursuit of peace and dialogue continues. By addressing these challenges, nations can move closer to stability and mutual understanding.